Hello, ladies and gentlemen, it's the Economancer once again. Today's going to be another quick video. I wasn't expecting to do another one, but I actually got a really great comment from Wealth for the 99%. This is a very good friend of mine. We obviously disagree heavily, but he left a very good criticism for my video and something that I want to talk about real quick. Normally, if someone sends out a substantive critique that's, like a paragraph, I'll respond in a paragraph. And to be honest, I'm a bit too lazy to actually write all this out, so I figured I would just go ahead, read into it, talk about it. Yeah, so first of all, thank you, Wealth for the 99%. This is a fantastic criticism, and let's see if we can work on it. And so as far as talking about Dems versus Republican economic policy, has been the case since Reagan that the Republicans tend to embrace trickle-down and laissez-faire policies, while Dems tend to be Keynesian. It seems like all this is meant when generalizing, especially since this is for a broad audience that may not know what either of those mean. But I don't think an audience needs to be propagandized by saying, well, they're trickle down. I think that's just as unreproachable as saying, well, they're laissez-faire, or they're X, they're Y, they're Z. The point I was getting at is you cannot boil down a Republican Party into the idea that they are laissez-faire or they are trickle down. That doesn't make any sense. Republicans or conservative Republicans could have very non-free market ideas. In fact, the Democrats during the 90s were the ones who pushed for a lot of the NAFTA to coming into a lot of these free trade agreements, while the current Republican Party is pro-tariff and stuff like that, like the Trump Publicans, right? They're very anti-global free market, even though they may be internal free markets. So it's hard to say that the Dems are associated with Keynesian policy, because they're not. No more than saying that the Republicans are laissez-faire. That's why I gave specific schools of thought for the Republicans, right? Because you have Republicans that are objectivists, that believe in the Ayn Rand form of, capitalism. Then you have Republicans that come from the Austrian school, most notably Ron Paul. Ron Paul writes a lot about Austrian economics. Then you have Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz has been on numerous occasions battling against the Federal Reserve folks from a market monetarist perspective. It goes on and on. You can't boil it down and say that they are X, Y, or Z. For one, the term trickle down doesn't make any sense. It's propaganda. And so I don't think that it's useful to say that a broad audience may not know any of those means, because I don't think a broad audience would know what trickle down means, because it's not even a thing, right? All right. And the point to stocks buyback is a pretty important one to address. Companies spending extra money from tax cuts on artificially inflating their valuation does nothing to help the company grow. It does. Improve workers' lives, possibly, or make better products, maybe. It is simply incentivized because CEOs are increasingly compensated by company shares, so by inflating their valuation, they increase their pay. Yes. Meanwhile, the companies that were the most egregious about this practices, the airlines, then asked the government for bailouts because they didn't choose to pay off the debts or save money for a market downturn. Yes. So the reality has been that companies got taxes cut, didn't use those to benefit consumers or workers, possibly, and then took more money from the government. Yes. And even if the AT&T used some money to pay down debt and research and development, the problem is that the macro-wise corporate debt dramatically increased after the 2017 tax cuts, which has more to do with the Fed interest rates being at all-time lows, keeping the economy looking good until the bubble burst last year. It used to be that stock buybacks were illegal in the U.S., and this is precisely why. It incentivizes propping companies with artificial growth, and you leave a link. Now, me and him has actually spoke about this quite a lot. This was kind of a misconception between the two of us. I was mainly talking about AT&T's debt to equity ratio. They were paying down their debt and they were changing their behavior based on this tax structure. And so the main point that I was trying to drive home with this is that you cannot have a 1 year change go from 1 year of tax cuts as a total fiscal year and then into the economic downturn that is the pandemic and derive conclusions from it and say, oh well, this first year that they didn't do anything. Well, of course, because there's the credibility constraint, because they don't know how long that tax cut will remain. And even then, even during that time period, we still saw increasing revenues from the government from these tax cuts. So again, if you're still seeing increasing revenue and you're not seeing damage happen to the private sector, then you're obviously finding something. Can these companies do better? Yes. Are some sectors bad? Possibly. That's what recessions are set up for. They kind of get rid of some of or they're supposed to. Let me take a step back. They're supposed to get rid of the companies that misallocate resources or use them improperly. Now, we have a problem in our current system, the too big to fail problem and stuff like that. Now, one of the big things that we're moving into now is moving into better corporate governance. If you're looking at the banking structures and looking at the differences between Basel 1, Basel 2, and Basel 3 when it comes to risk management and stuff like that, it is absolutely much more safe. Now, I should preface that nothing is 100% safe, but the risk management that a lot of these large banks are doing are significantly better than what they were prior to the financial crisis. And we've seen that kind of play out pretty well in some of the COVID-19 responses in banks. That doesn't mean all corporate governance is as good as banks. Each time that you're going to have some exogenous impact that punches it, it's going to make a difference. And increasing regulations in those places where it's most needed is going to happen, but it is an evolutionary process. It's not going to just show up one day and be better. We can't assume that the other side of the argument is automatically better. There has to be some motivation for it because we're creatures of habit. And again, we can deny that we may know what's best, but when you get into the system, it may look different. And, and then we're going into this idea of about paying down debt and the R&D from AT&T. To say that what AT&T hadn't done being beneficial, again, I think that's a little bit crazy. I think it was massively beneficial. Were there problems with them buying Time Warner? Did a lot of people get upset about that? Absolutely. Yeah. There's a lot of problems going on right now with a lot of these large companies conglomerating into, just 5-6 large companies in the U.S. Yes, that's a problem. We all agree. I made a statement about that, but I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. All right. So the next thing is, while talking about Bezos and other rich billionaires, it seems like you're making an assumption that people are just jealous and or that is him or me concerned zero-sum game. The problem is, one, it's an emotional claim on a vast groups of collective psychology. Concern is writing it off as civil rivalry. Look, I like you, but damn it, I'm not going to read all of this. Two, ignores the problem that people actually claim when it comes to massive consolidation of wealth. No, neither of those are true, and I'll tell you why. First, it's not an emotional claim. I'm saying he has zero-sum thinking. That was directly in response to his graph saying, look, the share of the economy is being captured by the 1%. That may be true, but that does not mean that it's just 1% that's gaining all of the growth. Obviously, the standards of living have changed. Everyone is doing better. By whatever measure you want to do that with, I mean, we can say from the 1980s, 1990s, I mean, televisions have changed. They've gotten a lot cooler. Cars, they've stayed approximately the same price since the 70s. That's awesome. So you can get a new car relatively cheap in comparison to what you could 20 years ago. the food production that we have, even though a lot of people don't like GMOs and stuff like that, a lot of that has gotten better over time. So, yes, overall, our standard of living is significantly higher than what it was in the 70s and 80s and 90s. And these are the times that he's pointing to when he's saying this is how much wealth that the 1% had. And as that wealth grew, so did the economy. So thinking that just because the 1% has more money, meaning there's not more money in the system, that's kind of silly. And that's why I'm saying it's zero-sum thinking. I'm not making a vast generalization on anyone's belief. Now, the second one, I'm not ignoring the problem. I specifically made a statement about if this is an issue, then the populace will vote. That's the whole purpose of knowing or trying to know the taste for economic redistribution, because that's a powerful incentive. There's a whole part of literature. This is Thomas Piketty, Emmanuel Saez, a little bit of Raj Chetty. All of these famous economists, they're out there working on finding what is the taste for redistribution, specifically in the United States. Does it need to go up? Now, when we have things like, you, for example, I think your name kind of sums it up. Well, for the 99%, Occupy Wall Street, that was a very important part. And yet, it doesn't seem like at even the local to the federal level that was what was chosen. I mean, Donald Trump won the presidency. He maintained enough power within the House and in the Senate to get it passed. So obviously, there is a large swath of the population that has a lower taste for redistribution. You can say it comes from propaganda from the Chicago school, which we'll get into in a moment, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's true. The point is when people are choosing, when they go write down their name and who they want to be president, senator, governor, all that stuff, it just so happens, again, however you feel about it, that side won, and the taste for redistribution of taxes in the United States was lower than what was expected. I'm not saying that people should be ignored. I'm saying that's who won. Now, we'll get into the idea of the anti-democratic relationship with capitalism. So there's a lot of criticisms that capitalism and democracy are necessarily in opposition of each other. Obviously, if you read any right-winger, they would tell you the exact opposite. They would tell you that you can't have freedom without capitalism. You can't have a constitutional republic without capitalism, because the moment you intervene in that, then, it's just all going to go downhill. If you think that once you remove the economic variable, that the political variable isn't cranked up to 10, you're silly, because that's what happened in the USSR. Right? Once you equalize the economic, the political, or the party status and the social status, those skyrocket. And so that becomes your biggest differentiator. And I would rather there be some economic differentiation than I would be to have party differentiation, because I'd rather keep my brain. I'd rather be poor, but to keep my thoughts, than I would be to be rich, but have to follow what everyone else says. And again, that's a mode of being. That's a general difference. So when people say that those two things are, incompatible, I think they're silly. Now, they also say that because you have wealth concentration, you're going to have increased corruption and stuff like that. And that may be true. I'm eventually going to be doing a video on corruption, or actually it will be a whole series of videos, because just like all the other theories out there in sociology and economics, you have the structural functionalist view of corruption, which says that it's called grease the wheel hypothesis, that corruption can be a net positive benefit for society. There's a lot of game theory that goes into this. One of those models is that, if you're looking at these people willing to, use corruptive behavior to get a contract, they're also the most likely to be the best at doing said contract. And their corruption that they're involving themselves in is just another price signal. Now, again, that's not to say that that's what the bulk of the literature says, but to deny grease the wheel hypothesis its day in court, that's just silly. You can't just outright dismiss it. Okay. Woo. It's taking a while. Talking about the growing number of millionaires in the U.S. relative to other countries without putting it in context and say the cost of living growth doesn't really tell us much about what the actual effects are. I don't really know what that means, but okay. So there is a growing number of millionaires in the U.S. relative to other countries. That's true. It's getting bigger. Without putting it in context to say that the cost of living growth doesn't really tell us much about what the actual effects are. I don't know what the actual effects might be. What I do know is that the United States has done fairly well. Again, lives are getting better. We have higher home ownership rates than most countries. We have high per capita GDP. We have high median wages. We have decent amount of education mobility, even if that might be debt driven, which that's a whole nother argument. But to say that you can't get into college, that's wrong. It's typically a choice because someone doesn't want to take on that much debt. That may be for the good or for the worse, but there's a price signal there. And if someone doesn't want to pay the price, then they don't go. That might be more beneficial than a system that allows everyone to go to college, because not everyone should go to college. And this is something I've talked about in a few other videos about increasing grievance studies and stuff like that. You know, going to college, the largest degree sets are stuff like psychology. So a bachelor's in psychology, you're going to get 60 grand in debt to get a bachelor's in psychology, and you're not going to do much with a bachelor's in psychology. A bachelor's in philosophy, you're not going to do a whole lot. Not saying that there aren't individuals who get these degrees that go out and do a lot, but in mass, it's not going to be that great. There's a very big demand for education. So a lot of education degrees. And I don't think the supply of children is big enough to warrant the demand side pull for these degrees, right? And so that's a big problem. So that's what the cost or the price signal is supposed to set you up with. Okay. Anyway, nor would it disprove concerns about the lack. Okay, more people holding more dollars doesn't equate to that being an improvement relative to cost of living. Okay, now we're talking about like the cost of living or the cost of doing business. If we're talking about the cost of living specifically, that's an economic structure argument. So that's relative to where you are in the United States more so than the United States in general, because you're going to have vastly different places. They're going to make the average, go a little wonky, even the average. Now, looking at the median, I don't think it's that big of a deal. I think it's on par, if not better than most countries. Up until recently, it has been. I mean, we've had a lot of economic structure issues as of recently. That's why we had Donald Trump get elected as president, because we saw a lot of problems that happened with the Rust Belt. Now, a lot of people want to point to all different types of things. One of the things I'm going to tell you about what happened to the Rust Belt is, one, the Rust Belt had some serious anti-competitive behavior that was going on. Two, it put all of its eggs in the basket for basic sector, which is the model that I've used, and it really didn't work on the development side versus the growth side. And so when that export-based market collapsed because it was facing global competition and it was facing extremely high wages for the work that was being done because of unions, once it collapsed the system around it. And that's a big problem. That was a regional economic development problem. Now, you're going to blame the U.S. in general for that. I don't think that that's a useful criticism. I think that's something that regional economic developers now take into consideration. Places like Charlotte, North Carolina, they're making sure that they're diversifying their portfolio for the sectors that they are bringing in to be their basic sectors. And even smaller metropolitan statistical areas, they're making sure that they're not putting all their eggs in one basket for the basic sector. So yeah, that goes into that. And then when we're talking about would it disprove concerns about the lack of economic mobility, this is evidenced by the U.S. faltering in economic mobility. You say the word faltering. Faltering means that it was really low at one point in time. The U.S. has consistently had problems with economic mobility. Now, I was mainly talking about social and economic mobility. In this, you point to rank the social mobility of 82 countries. I completely agree that we're not the best when it comes to social mobility, and we're not the best when it comes to economic mobility. What I said is that it's getting better. Over time, the United States is consistently getting better when it comes to economic and social mobility. And even by this graph, it was 27th. Now you're thinking, oh wow, that's 27th. That's really low. Yeah, to some extent. But if you remove the South, it's actually not that low. It's actually probably like top 10. But the South has had some significant mobility problems. I can only imagine why. And for whatever you may believe, there were systemic industrial biases against the South, and there was also internal biases in the South that reduced economic mobility. You can look up Raj Chetty's 2013 paper where he shows the breakdown of economic mobility by county in the United States, and all of the places with very, very low social mobility, which takes the average down, is in the South, which has had systemic economic bias and has been stratified by its economic structures due to a lack of human capital. North Carolina didn't have like a legitimate school system until post-Civil War, whereas many places up north did. 2, industrialization. It was an agrarian-based economy for quite some time. 3, when there was industrialization, there was a lot of flim-flam going on about making sure that the South didn't get a lot of industrialization going on. So yeah, that's one of those issues. So if you remove the South, it goes great. It goes way up. It's really good. But it is the South that brings down the United States, and for several reasons. All right. Also, Bezos, we can't just claim that he made things better and just ignore how the government helped build Amazon, though, and subsidies, and ironically, given your talk of antitrust, how have allowed Amazon to grow without hesitation despite monopolistic practices. Again, I stated very clearly that it was a double-edged sword. It is a double-edged sword. You're going to, as market shares increase, you're going to raise your economies of scale. That's why clustering and regional economics works so well, because it allows for better economies of scale. However, absolutely, monopolies are not good and they should be broken up. And I even said this, that they should be broken up. Now, as for the government helped build Amazon, though, subsidies, sure. There was also Jeff Bezos' brilliant plan to run the company in a deficit for like 10 years plus, until he could capture enough of the market. And once he captured enough of the market, he could jam prices up. And then everybody had to pay. It was a brilliant plan. Say what you want. Nobody thought you could do it. And he did it. So, yeah. He did a thing that people didn't believe you could do. There was some government help. Government helps everybody. That's not saying much. But what built Amazon was Jeff Bezos' willingness to risk everything on his long shot plan that he was going to keep his prices below everyone else's to the point that he was running in the red for years until he got to where he's at now. That's impressive. Again, we should give him at least a high five or a couple $100 billion. Um, Now, what happens now? Should he get busted up? I mean, it. We've got to have a serious talk about like Amazon Web Services and stuff like that. These are things that we need to talk about. I'm not saying that Jeff Bezos is some Jesus Christ walking and saving the world. I'm saying for every bad thing that people point out, there's always a good thing. And to just completely forget the good thing and just point out the bad, that's sad to me because I like looking at the good. I just tend to be a positive person in general. Okay. Bezos didn't make Amazon by himself. No, he didn't, but he was a major reason why it existed. Nor did he send your packages. No, I don't care. His parents, the government, and the taxpayers helped fund it, and the workers made it happen. Absolutely. I'm sure, man. And all of them got paid for it too. So did he. He was willing to put out risk. He was willing to do some social and economic entrepreneurship, and he got what he needed out of it, or he got what he deserved, quote unquote, out of it. Now, what happens later, that's up in the air, and that's for the population of the United States to decide, and as well as, the government, and whether or not he's, doing anti-competitive practices. He's in a lawsuit, or, well, Amazon and Twitter are kind of battling right now against Parler. That's something to be taken into account. If you're pro cracking up, Amazon, you should be pro cracking up Amazon Web Services. You should be promoting the idea that Parler should win this case going to federal court for, for anti-competitive behavior. But I don't know very many people opposite of my political spectrum that are going to just jump out there and go, yeah, burn Amazon. Let Parler exist, because they're going to be more likely to go, well, Jeff Bezos is a Democrat. They're promoting Twitter, Democrats. So you have to ask yourself, what's more important, your economic justification or your political justification? And I'm pro economic justification. So however that lands, I hope it lands in busting up a monopoly, if that's what it is. The reality is that instead of arguing that monopolistic companies like Amazon and Walmart are helped by antitrust, not supported by evidence, absolutely, I just literally gave you evidence in the video with regards to the Dollar General, the Dollar Store, or Dollar General, Family Dollar, and I think Dollar Tree were all going to combine into one company, was sued by Walmart, lost on antitrust. Or they wouldn't allow them to to conglomerate into one company because Walmart would have to face heavy competition from someone that had the supply chain ability to battle against them, as well as maintaining really low prices in roughly the same ways that Walmart does. So I don't know how that's not evidence. All right, we should look at why the U.S. has been so terrible at enforcing antitrust since the Lochner era. Again, ironically, the shift in antitrust occurred directly because of the influence of the Chicago school. No, not at all. The increased antitrust behavior is in opposition to the Chicago school. If you look at the Chicago school and regulation, regulation as it stands was basically written by Stigler, Viner, and Buchanan from the Chicago school. Most of what we have in public economics, that comes from Buchanan. That comes from the Virginia school, which is a derivative of the Chicago school. Now, in this paper, which I'm going to disagree with heavily, even though I agree with its outcome, I disagree with how it got there. Not once was Stigler, Viner, Knight, Friedman, any of these people anti-regulation. What they were, was regulatory capture by elites, which is a function of the corruption that you're talking about. when it comes to wealth inequality in the United States. When you have this wealth inequality, that's when you have the regulatory capture. That's the big issue. See, my work in corruption is specifically looking at that. My work in income inequality is specifically looking at that. How does that work? It damn sure don't come from them buying votes. That is not real. What really happens is regulatory capture when businesses get in bed with the government. That's the scary part. That's when you have Jeff Bezos and Amazon Web Services and Twitter being able to cancel anyone who has an opposing opinion of them and making sure that the cultural hegemon stays. That is corruption of the highest order that's being ignored. And if you think somehow the Chicago school is what was behind that, you're dead wrong and you've never read anything by the Chicago school. Because go read Stigler's regulations, his history of economics and regulations and stuff like that. Go jump into that. Go read Noller and all these papers that broke into the world of government, or I shouldn't say government corruption, but government regulatory practices and monopolies. And you'll absolutely see a giant disagreement. Lastly, I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that saying removing regulations and freeing up the market will have us see capitalism flourish is extremely idealistic and ignores the historical context that actually created the Sherman Antitrust Act. No, it won't. No. Look, when the government gets in bed with big business, it does it through economic regulation. It doesn't there's no other way for it to do it. So it will regulate anti-competitive behavior against the market. That's what it does. That's how it works. I don't know what to tell you about that. I don't want that. I would much prefer to have an economic system that forces competition. And as that competition increases and it does move towards a monopoly, there's going to be a new set of competitors, not in that market, but from a different market emerging. That's Schumpeter. That's Schumpeter's creative destruction. That's was how he dealt with non-competitive equilibrium markets, was by bringing in this Schumpeterian engine of economic growth through creative destruction by having, as a monopoly power increases, there is some technological bust. Boom, goes through, destroys that, competitive until it comes to an apex again. New market comes through, busts it. That's how it works. Again, Amazon is a perfect example of that. There were like 3 major bookstores that were going on right now. Not so much the mom and pop shops, but it was like Books A Million, Barnes and Nobles. Those are the only 2 that I remember. And I think there was one more, but those were the major distributors of books in the United States. Amazon came in and buried all of them through a new mode of, through a new technological frontier, a new mode of being, new everything. There you go. That's Schumpeter's brilliant insight into economics and how to deal with non-competitive equilibriums, which is what we end up having. As a market enters in, it's highly competitive. Everybody's seeking the profits. Everything keeps dying down until the economy of scales go to the highest. That's typically the monopolist. And then as that goes wild, here comes a new market, comes in and busts it up. Every time. Look at the S&P 500, I think, or the top 50. I think it's different than what it was 15 years ago, different than what it was 10 years ago, right? We didn't even have Facebook. Well, hold on now. We did have Facebook 10 years ago. Wow, I'm old. 20 years ago, we didn't have Facebook. We didn't have Twitter. We didn't have Amazon, any of those companies up there. But now they are. I mean, I grew up on Sears, right? That doesn't even exist anymore. What was there prior to Sears? There was a big company prior to Sears that they were like, oh my God, we got to bust this up. And then Sears came in and was like, we got a catalog right hook, and beat them out. Didn't beat them out in their market, beat them out by creating a new market structure along the same lines. So no, that's not true. Anyway, I'll probably do more on this. I'll probably talk to him more one on one. One of these days, we might bring him onto this show. It should be fun, but I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you've learned, and I hope you go watch his videos, like, share, and subscribe to him because he's a fantastic guy. Have a wonderful one.